a decade, to a time when American confidence grew so high that it seemed the good times would last forever. In 1919, the US had emerged victorious from World War I. A mood of optimism was in the air. Britain and its European allies were exhausted financially from the war. But the US economy was thriving, and the world danced to the American tune.
The uncertainties were over. There seemed little doubt about what was going to happen. America was going on the greatest, gaudiest spree in history, and there was going to be plenty to tell about it.
In the 1920s, everyday life was changing. Electrification transformed America. Towns were hooked up to the grid. New technologies emerged. Aeroplanes, radios, domestic goods that had started life as luxuries now became necessities. The car industry also boomed as people flocked to buy one of the new Ford or Chrysler automobiles. An era of boundless prosperity seemed to have begun.
This is the flowering of consumer culture and mass consumption on a scale never before seen. There is also heavy installment buying to encourage people to buy big-ticket consumer items so that they can buy those items on credit.
This type of consumer credit was another innovation of the 1920s. For the first time, the idea of buy now, pay later hit the mainstream.
And there's a kind of play culture that develops alongside this consumerism, which says, we believe now in instant gratification. Take care of the now. Don't worry about the future. Live for the moment.
The effects of the catastrophic crash on Wall Street rippled out across America. Even those who had never owned shares and who had never benefited from the stock market boom became victims too. The crash had undermined Americans' faith in their fragile banking system, made up of thousands of small-town banks that lacked the size or reputation to convince customers that their money was safe. As confidence in the economy sank further, a domino effect began. In 1931, over 2,000 banks failed.
After the crash, the banks closed. That, I think, affected us a little more seriously, us, meaning us, the people of my stature. Many people had money in the bank, little bit of money, a couple of $100, you know, $1,000 maybe.
There was no infrastructure then. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to guarantee people's deposits. There was no way to back up the banks. So if the banks had made bad choices, you as a depositor paid for it. You went to go get your money, it wasn't there. And then people would hear that the bank down the street wasn't good, and they worried about their own bank, and then that would cause a run on their bank. And it became a terrible, vicious cycle. And something like 3,000 banks closed in the following couple of years after that. The whole financial system then seemed not just unstable, but worthless.
After that, when people saved money, they were very leery of banks, and money went under the mattress.
The stock market crash in 1929 did not create the Great Depression, but it did start a sequence of events that eventually culminated with the Great Depression.
Well, you know, some of this is going to sound sort of familiar. The banks were loaning money for the stock market, the companies were loaning money, the brokerages were loaning money, and when those prices fell, all that money just disappeared. Almost immediately, companies began to feel the pinch of not having the capital and of having lost money, and they began to lay off people, to let people go, to shut down production.
There were mass bankruptcies. There was a liquidity crisis of exactly the same kind we have today. That is to say, all kinds of businesses could no longer get loans to keep themselves afloat, even if those businesses were entirely solvent. They couldn't get the kind of short-term commercial credit to pay their workers, to buy new inventory, to pay their suppliers. And so they began going bankrupt. And as they went bankrupt, they laid people off. And as they laid people off, demand fell. And this is what does traumatic damage to the whole society. So traumatic that it's second only to the Civil War in American memory as a tragic moment in American history.
But in 1932, 12 years of Republican rule came to an end.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Democrat Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide victory. His first task was to restore confidence.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Seen as a savior, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people and to regulate the financial system.
There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
Although Roosevelt restored confidence in the banking system, the Great Depression would last until the outbreak of World War II. Then, as now, the globalized economy meant that the crash and subsequent depression rippled out across the world. In Britain, there was a slump in manufacturing, and millions lost their jobs. Germany, still suffering from defeat in the First World War, was hit even harder.
So many people had their life savings destroyed during the Great Depression that it created in many countries a desire for some authoritarian government that would save them, that would rescue the economy.
No doubt that crash and the Depression strengthened anti-capitalist movements.